All right, welcome back to another episode of the Future Cities podcast. I'm your host for the month, Stephen Elser. So this month we'll be chatting with two scientists in the URX-SRN about a paper that they'd recently published called Temporal Evolution of Green Stormwater Infrastructure Strategies in 3 U.S. Cities. Now, if you want a refresher or an introduction to the topic of green infrastructure, I'd recommend going back and listening to one of our previous episodes in which we define the term and provide some history, as well as discussing a really incredible system of wetlands in Valdivia, Chile. And that episode is available in English and Spanish. But without further ado, let's get to our guests. Joining us today is Lauren McPhillips and Marissa Matsler. Lauren is an assistant professor at Penn State University in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Welcome, Lauren.
Thanks, Stephen.
And Marissa is a postdoctoral researcher at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. Welcome, Marissa.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. Before we jump in, I'd just like to give the listeners a chance to get to know you a little bit more. So could each of you tell us a little bit about your general research interests, why it interests you so much, and how did you get to where you are now?
Sure, I'll go ahead. This is Lauren, and I consider myself both a hydrologist and an ecological engineer. I'm really interested in how we manage stormwater in developed areas and how we can learn from nature and use more ecological approaches when we manage stormwater so that we can create more sustainable and resilient cities. I've worked both on the sort of really small scale nitty-gritty design elements of green stormwater infrastructure, like how different soil types in these features might influence their water quality function. But then I've also done some work like what we're talking about today, taking a wider look at how cities are planning and implementing green infrastructure. I used to study water quality in more rural areas, but I realized cities are a huge area of growth. More and more people are living in cities. And so there's so much opportunity for thinking about how to better design more sustainable cities so that, people and the environment can live in harmony.
Yes, and hello. I'm Marissa. I am a social scientist myself, but I'm also an interdisciplinarian. So I began with a degree in marine biology and got into environmental management. And so a lot of my work, a lot of my motivation begins from the ocean and protecting creatures in the ocean and thinking about what we do on the land and what cities are doing and putting out on the land, how that ends up influencing the rest of the environment. So that's a lot of my motivation. And these days, my research is focused on green infrastructure policy. So as a social scientist, I primarily speak with staff at municipalities, policymakers, decision makers, engineers, other folks, and try to understand how we're designing green infrastructure. How do people think about nature in the city, and how does that influence the green infrastructure that we see on the ground? One of the most fun projects that I have been a part of is asking and interviewing residents and people living in cities about their perspective of green infrastructure. What do they think of it? Do they like it? Do they dislike it? How does it influence their lives? So that's some of the work that I'm doing now. And it's great to be able to work with folks like Lauren and others on the URX project, really putting together the social with the ecological and the technological. It's really fun.
Yeah, sounds fun.
Yeah.
Challenging too, I imagine.
Indeed. Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for those introductions. So let's go ahead and go into the paper now. So right in the title, it mentions green stormwater infrastructure. And so I guess for our listeners first, could we just give us a brief definition of what green infrastructure is, and then specifically what's green stormwater infrastructure?
Sure. Yeah. And as you guys will know from some of our past episodes, the term green infrastructure is a contested term. So there is not one definition out there. But generally what folks are talking about when they say green infrastructure is the use of natural systems or nature. So soils and plants, vegetated spaces to provide utility services. And so in the US, primarily we're focused on what natural areas can provide in the terms of stormwater services. So both treatment and storage of stormwater. So when we mention green stormwater infrastructure, we're talking both about existing natural areas, but also human-built infrastructure that takes advantage of vegetation and soils, includes those things as components to deal with stormwater within the city. So one of the reasons that green stormwater infrastructure is particularly important is that oftentimes when we design and fund and think about infrastructure in the United States, we're usually thinking about human-built infrastructure. So we term this the gray infrastructure. Things like storage tanks to hold on to flood control measures, or a drinking water treatment plant to be able to provide clean drinking water to us. And so most of our systems at the municipal scale, a lot of our asset management systems, our other funding systems, our maintenance systems are all set up to take care of these human-built systems. So when we start to include living components, the trees, the soils, things like this, vegetated land into the category of infrastructure, we actually have to, we come up against some challenges. And so we need to work through those, from my perspective, we need to work through those institutionally, and also learn how these systems are working from an ecological, a hydrological point of view as well.
Great, thank you. So related to all that, you mentioned how traditionally when we're thinking about ways to manage stormwater, we think of gray infrastructure solutions. So I was wondering, can one of you just provide just a brief history of how stormwater has traditionally been managed in the U.S. over time?
Sure. So, back when cities first started developing, not surprisingly, there wasn't much being done with stormwater yet. Basically, buildings and roads were being put in, and people started to notice that these sort of human-built features were having an impact on where the rain could move in the landscape, and were starting to cause problems with flooding. So as these surfaces were being built that we call impervious surfaces, buildings or roads where the rain can't soak in, there started to be more flooding, and so cities started realizing they needed to build storm sewer pipe networks to help get rid of this stormwater that was now occurring on the streets, and to help route it into streams and away from the city, so we weren't having issues with people or horses or vehicles or whatever being able to get around. This made new problems, though, because we're helping to route this water really efficiently down to the streams started flooding and getting really eroded and becoming really flashy, as we like to call it. So, floods getting bigger and happening faster. So a few decades ago, a lot of cities started implementing various stormwater control measures, as we call them, which are various features that we can put in the landscape that might help slow down and clean stormwater. So these are features like, say, a detention basin, which might receive water off of a street or a parking lot, detain it for a little bit, and then maybe infiltrate it or help it soak into the ground to get to groundwater. Or it might help filter out pollutants and improve the water quality of the stormwater. And so there's lots of different types of these stormwater control measures out there. And there seems to be a transition that's been happening in these more recent decades, where the types being implemented are moving towards green or ecologically based features. And this was sort of the idea that we wanted to start thinking about in this analysis that we're talking about today.
Awesome, thank you. That was a great little history lesson. But why would you say it's important for us to understand sort of the way that green stormwater infrastructure implementation has changed, and to understand what type of these infrastructure features are being implemented? Why is that important for us to understand?
I think it's important to understand how these things are changing through time, because it changes our risk factors in cities. So if we are looking at the way that we design our infrastructure today is going to influence what risks are coming up later. So as Lauren was just mentioning, we started putting impervious surfaces in as cities were beginning. We didn't really. I don't think people really understood what kind of influence those would have through time. But then as we started to see stormwater, we created the stormwater problem from some of those initial infrastructures that we began with. So it's important to understand how what we're putting in today, how that might change things in the future, kind of think about some of those unintended consequences, but also to be able to look at distribution of service delivery in cities as well. So if we can see what kinds of infrastructure are being put in the ground, where they're being put in, and in what time frame, we can start to see what services are being delivered and to whom across cities. So we can really get into understanding different service distributions, perhaps potentially uneven distribution of services, and some of those unintended consequences in the future. So one of the things that we did in this paper was also think a little bit about ecosystem service delivery across different types of green stormwater infrastructure. So in this is kind of telling us, there's a bunch of different kinds, different types of green stormwater infrastructure we could put in the ground. So some of the human-built ones are things like bioswales, rain gardens. There's also just, ditches on the side of the road. We have other things that are underground that are more gray infrastructure oriented. And each of these is going to have different ecosystem impacts and outcomes, as well as different social impacts and outcomes. And so if we want to know what kinds of ecosystem services are being delivered in a city, we need to know actually what kind of green infrastructure is on the ground and at what quantities and what time frame. And surprisingly, we actually don't know much about that at this moment, looking across cities. So each city does have their own inventory of these things, but actually looking across cities and looking for similarities and differences, that was really what we were trying to get at in this study.
Yeah, and so something that I noticed just about the three cities that you compared there. So for the people that haven't read this paper, the three cities that were compared are Phoenix, Arizona, Baltimore, Maryland, and Portland, Oregon. And these cities are just really, really different from one another in terms of their location, their history, their climate, their politics, and a whole range of other factors. So I guess why compare such different cities? And what sort of challenges did you encounter while trying to make these comparisons?
So you're definitely right. These are very different cities in some ways, but then of course there's similarities across them as well. Portland, part of that city, its stormwater system is what we call a combined sewer system, where the sanitary sewers, which drain our toilets and showers and stuff from our houses, can actually can be combined with water from the stormwater system when there's too much stormwater, when it's really intense rain events. And so we end up with overflows from the combined sewer systems into the river, causes lots of bad water quality issues. So anyways, Portland has that, which, causes some regulatory things that I'm sure we'll talk about later related to stormwater. But the other two cities don't have that. They have what we call separated sewer systems. But Phoenix is a desert city, and Baltimore is an older city with, that's on the Chesapeake Bay, which has a lot of water quality concerns. And so, even though they're different, we wanted to see how they might also be experiencing some similar transitions, how different levels of governance, through similar federal regulations might have, similar influences, or whether like more local differences from these different factors might might play a bigger role. The convenient reason that we actually looked at these three cities is that they all happen to be part of this urban resilience to extremes network that you guys, I think, have heard about in previous podcast episodes. All of the cities, these cities and the others of the 9 cities in our network are really excited about green infrastructure as an important strategy for managing stormwater. But these 3 cities happen to be the most experienced in implementing green stormwater infrastructure, and they all happen to have really extensive data sets of what types of green stormwater infrastructure they put in and when. So we thought it could be really useful to look at their implementation strategies for our other cities that are still more in the earlier stages of considering how to implement green stormwater infrastructure. In terms of the data, even though these cities had pretty good data, we still had to put in some effort to make it comparable. I think one of the biggest issues with trying to look at these different stormwater management strategies across these different cities is that a lot of the city, like everybody kind of uses slightly different names or terminologies for these different features. So in Phoenix, they really go hardcore for what they call retention basins. That's the main facility that they install. But the way it's designed, if you actually look at like the design specifications, it's actually more like what we would call an infiltration facility in other cities. So we definitely had to put in some work to unify these different terminologies. The categories that we ultimately came up with were filters, green roofs, infiltration facilities, basins, porous pavement, swales, underground filters, and other, which basically was for anything else that didn't fit into the other categories. One of the other challenges was, there certainly were bits of data missing in some cases. Like we were really interested in how these things have been constructed over time. And of course, some of the features didn't have dates. But despite these issues, there was still a ton of really rich data there to learn from. And so it was really exciting to, that the stormwater utilities in these different cities were willing to share the data with us that they had put a lot of effort into getting together.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that sounds like it would be a lot of work. So after you've collected all this data, what did you expect to find? And maybe more importantly, what did you actually find, both in terms of the overall portfolios and then maybe the differences that you saw between cities?
So I think one of the kind of like overarching themes that I already alluded to was that we came in with this idea that many cities are experiencing a transition from more gray stormwater control measures towards more green or ecologically based stormwater control measures. And even though like this is assumed in general across people who think about stormwater management, it hadn't really been sort of systematically analyzed. And the cool thing was that our analysis of these 3 cities generally supported the fact that this transition was happening. For example, we saw in Portland that they put in a lot of underground filters early on, but then they've moved in recent decade or so much more towards these curbside vegetated swales that they call green streets. Baltimore has also seen a pretty big transition towards more green or ecologically focused features. But then Phoenix has remained pretty focused on this one type of infiltration facility, though even they are starting to have a little implementation of some of these newer types of green stormwater infrastructure, like these ones we call bioretention basins. Overall, Portland definitely lived up to its reputation as being a leader in green infrastructure. Certainly anyone that thinks about green infrastructure would think about Portland as one of the main cities that are known for this. And Portland had by far the greatest quantity of green stormwater infrastructure features. But then, there were distinctive features of the other cities too, like Baltimore had the biggest diversity in types being implemented. And Phoenix had a surprising amount of these green stormwater infrastructure features for the fact that it's a desert city, because they're really interested in flood control. And just, one really cool observation that came up in the timelines that we constructed was how the implementation rate of these features plummets during the recession around 2008 or so, because the stormwater control measures, the implementation of them is tightly driven by rules on development. But I will let Marissa talk a little bit more about what we learned about some of these different drivers and such.
Yeah, it was really interesting looking at some of the drivers, I think, especially in a comparative way, because when people are talking about green infrastructure in the U.S., a lot of times there's this reference back to the EPA and thinking, the Environmental Protection Agency, and thinking about their particular definition that's like pushing this stormwater focus. And also the push of the Clean Water Act to deal with combined sewer overflows that Lauren was just talking about. So a lot of the conversation around green infrastructure usually revolves around this, combined sewer overflow space. And in Portland, we see that one of the big drivers, or one of the big things that allowed green infrastructure to develop in Portland was the consent decree to deal with their combined sewer overflows. And so they ended up starting quite a bit sooner than many other cities in terms of addressing combined sewer overflow with green infrastructure. So we're talking back in the early 90s, looking at ways that they could actually address this. And so oftentimes, when you go to talk to folks in Baltimore, they often feel, or they've expressed that, they're sort of outside the system. They're like, hey guys, we don't have a combined sewer. We have this separated sewer. So there are other reasons that we're doing green infrastructure. And so we think that might have something to do with the different portfolios that we see in the two cities. So in Portland, a lot of the driver is coming from the federal government and the Clean Water Act, saying, okay, you need to deal with this combined sewer overflow. And that really gave a lot of impetus, a lot of money being poured into, okay, how can we do this, and allowed green infrastructure to be one of the solutions. Whereas in Baltimore, we see more of this influence of the Chesapeake Bay water quality issues there, and that at the state level, you see a much stronger push towards green infrastructure. So they actually have stormwater management design guidelines. So environmental site design (ESD) is put together at the state level and really pushed at the state level for Baltimore. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of the green infrastructure coming about. So this is, again, it's also closely tied with Phoenix. So in Baltimore and Phoenix, the design guidelines and development are a big part of how green infrastructure is put in the ground. So while Portland has quite a large public program, so the city is actually building a lot of these green infrastructure, particularly green streets, the rain gardens in Portland there, the bioswales. We see that in Baltimore or especially in Baltimore, that there's a lot more options for developers to put in different kinds of facilities, depending on what they need to do to meet the ESD guidelines. And so also, again, it was so fascinating to see that dip with the recession in Phoenix, a development being such a large driver within Baltimore and in Phoenix.
Yeah, and for our listeners, if you get a chance to go and read this paper that we're talking about, it's really striking to look at just the steep drop off in this implementation after, especially in Phoenix after the recession. It's really, really interesting to look at. And Marissa, you've highlighted a lot of the differences in terms of these drivers in the cities, but could you talk a little bit more about their similarities?
As far as similarities are concerned, though, perhaps I could say similarities. It is very interesting to see that that while the definitions and the terminology, as Lauren mentioned, are quite different across the cities, and often people like to have their own terms for many of these things, it is surprising the overlap in the actual specifications of some of these facilities. So what's interesting, I think, is also thinking about how these specifications are shared across cities. So one of the interesting things in having more discussions between Portland and Baltimore is to note that originally low impact development ideas were being developed in Florida and in Maryland. And these ideas really influenced early on what was happening in Portland and how they were addressing their combined sewer overflow. So those standards and specifications came originally from the East Coast to Portland, but then were standardized even further and specified in Portland. And then when Baltimore was beginning to look for standards for their bioswale facilities, they actually used Portland's specifications first off when they started to build the first facilities, and then again adjusted those through time as they saw how they fit in their locality. So there's a lot of sharing across these cities. And I think that lends itself to show that there are more similarities across the cities than you might expect, even though, as we mentioned earlier, they're quite different in terms of climate, context, age, and these other factors.
Yeah, right. That seems pretty surprising to me anyway, that they did share so many similarities, given how you mentioned how different they really are. But were either of you surprised by anything else that you found?
I mean, Marissa already pointed it out a little bit, but I think it's useful to mention again just how there's this assumption that federal regulations in general are a really important driver of these sorts of new stormwater management strategies, but yet two of the cities, Baltimore and Phoenix, again don't have the sort of federal regulatory hammer, as Marissa likes to call it, of CSO control plans. And yet they still have a lot of this sort of green stormwater infrastructure development. And I can't remember if we mentioned this earlier, but EPA, EPA is, of course, the agency that's managing a lot of the regulations at the federal level, and they officially endorsed green infrastructure as a so-called wet weather infrastructure solution for managing stormwater in 2007. But yet, we saw implementation in all the cities of various sorts of strategies well before that.
It points to show that this is a longer trend that's been building for quite a while in cities, and now I think just has a name. It has terminology associated with it.
I was also surprised too, just how many stormwater control measures that Phoenix had. We think of a desert city like it doesn't rain much. Why do they need much in the way of stormwater management infrastructure? But when it rains, it really rains quite intensely, and flooding can be a big issue. And so they have really the regional flood control authority there, which is called the Flood Control District of Maricopa County. They passed regulations, a while back, mandating that a certain size, a certain amount of water coming off of new development be able to be retained in some sort of stormwater control measure when any new development is put in. And so for more than 3 decades now, Phoenix has had implementation of these mostly these infiltration facilities with any new development going in. And so they've built up a lot of these features around the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is, I think, will be pretty surprising to people that maybe aren't from Phoenix, that we do have so many stormwater control measures in such a dry place. It is kind of funny. So this paper gives us a better understanding of sort of what the current and historical state of this green stormwater implementation is. But could you tell us a little bit about the implications of these different implementation strategies in the cities?
Yeah, so as Marissa said earlier, this was obviously a big motivation for doing this analysis, was that these different sorts of green stormwater infrastructure features have different sorts of functions and benefits. And so we looked at the sort of types that were being implemented and tried to think a little bit about what the implications were for benefits. And one challenge for sure was that there's not a lot of data out there on this stuff. There are some there were data on maybe a few specific functions or data for specific features, and not necessarily in these cities. So while there was some to work with, this is definitely an opportunity to collect more data on this sort of stuff to make sure that these functions or services that we're assuming these features are providing are actually being provided. So that being said, what we could say from what we found was that with this transition to more ecologically based features, there is more potential for water quality improvement as well as other sorts of co-benefits. So there's been some work that's been comparing these sorts of different strategies, like sort of these older strategies like big retention ponds, to some of these newer green stormwater infrastructure strategies like bioretention basins, which show that some of these newer features can provide better runoff reduction, better removal of certain pollutants like sediment or nitrogen. So we do think that there's this transitioning happening to enhanced water quality as well. And there's this assumption about a lot of these other co-benefits, like that there's aesthetic improvement and that there might be like an enhanced habitat for some of these things. And there were little bits of data on that, but it was hard to find a lot to really support that notion strongly. In Phoenix, there's an interesting example about the implications for function. I mentioned how they really mostly construct these infiltration facilities, but these facilities do actually vary in their ground cover. They can have either turf grass, gravel, or xeriscaping, which is basically desert vegetation. And so these grass basins can provide the benefit of cooling in, Phoenix, which can be super hot at times of the year, based on evapotranspiration from the grass. And in some places, it's really cool that they actually use these basins for athletic fields because they build them to be really big and shallow. And so you actually see like baseball diamonds in some of these. However,
I played soccer in some of those retention basins when I was a little kid.
Yeah, it's super cool. And it was like, people talk about these things being multifunctional, and it was really neat to see that actually being the case. But of course, this turf grass has to be irrigated to stay alive there. And so it requires input of lots of water, which is a big deal in a desert city. The xeric basins, on the other hand, don't require water inputs other than periodic stormwater, of course. And they do have potential to provide habitat for things like insects or maybe even birds. But then you do lose that cooling benefit that comes from the turf grass. Over time, we did see that there has been less construction of the turfgrass basin. So it was nice to see that, because we generally think that, the benefits are, it's probably good to mostly move towards these more, the xeric and the gravel sorts of basins. And, there's generally been increased awareness of water use. And so that's probably started to drive this transition to not have quite so many of the turf grass basins.
Great. Go ahead, Marissa.
I would add also, just to kind of build on that and talk a bit about, some of the cultural ecosystem services and the aesthetics that Lauren mentioned. One of the interesting things in thinking about these these different features is green infrastructure is interesting because it brings people more directly engaged with their infrastructure. So often, stormwater infrastructure has been under the ground. There's big, again, like tanks and infiltration basins and pipes all underground, and people don't usually see them or think about them day to day. And so a lot of the features that we were looking at here, these basins, for example, Stephen, that you played soccer in, and other, bioswales in Portland on the side of the street, people are interacting directly with these, sometimes in positive ways and sometimes in negative ways. And so I think that's something that is a big implication for planning moving forward, and also for what services are provided and to whom within cities. So definitely something for us to think about more as we go along with this research.
So in that vein, you mentioned going along with this research. Do you guys have future plans to build off of this work?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly are interested in digging more into these drivers. We really just did sort of a cursory search of like planning documents, and we did some consulting with some various stormwater managers in the cities, but like getting more into some more extensive interviews would be really interesting to learn a bit more about, what's truly been some of the drivers, because there's things that aren't really captured in planning documents, like, say, the changes in technologies, or the fact that there was like a mayor or some other political appointee who was just really excited about green infrastructure. So those things are a little bit harder to get at in terms of seeing what's influenced these transitions. And in like I was saying earlier, we really need more data on some of these different functions. And I've been thinking about this a bit, but Stephen, of course, our awesome host here, has some plans, right, to try to get at some of that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm hoping to go out in some of the green infrastructure features in Phoenix and measure some typically desired ecosystem services, things like heat mitigation and infiltration rates and things like that. Hopefully we'll have some more on the ground physical data to pair with some of the work that you two have already put in.
That is awesome. That's great to hear.
Yeah, and ideally we'll hopefully, once I sort of get used to the methods and whatnot here in Phoenix, that I hope to expand this to other cities and draw comparisons and similar features in different cities and see sort of compare how their functions differ or how they're the same.
And one of the other things that this reminds me of too is one of the things that I think the group is interested in following up on is how maintenance influences all the things that we're talking about here today. How is that going to change the function of these through time? And in thinking about funding of infrastructure, maintenance is always extremely difficult to obtain funds for. It's just not as exciting to talk about fixing the pipes as it is to build something new and shiny. And so I think that's another thing that we're really hoping to move forward on, is to look at maintenance plans across these cities and see how that is potentially also a driver or something that's influencing what kinds of facilities are put in the ground. And maybe moving forward, some cities might be changing their green infrastructure portfolio depending on the maintenance problems or successes that they have seen. So excited to work on that next.
I was totally thinking of you earlier today, Marissa, because I was walking around campus and saw some bioretention basins that still had water days after it rained, even though they're supposed to be well draining. And I was wondering what's going on. I don't know that they've been maintained right, because they're not doing the functions they're supposed to be right now.
So at this point, unfortunately, Lauren's internet cut out, so we couldn't hear her anymore. And earlier, I'd asked both Lauren and Marissa to think of a summary of their paper in the form of a haiku, so we'll just go ahead and jump to me asking Marissa about that. I guess then we'll move on to the moment of truth, and this will all be on you, Marissa. Could you summarize your paper in the form of a haiku?
I would just like to mention the number of syllables that green stormwater infrastructure contains. It's a little excessive. So this was tricky for us. Let's see. Green infrastructure. How does it change through space-time? Let's take a look.
Beautiful. Absolutely stunning.
Oh, she's back.
Hey, so I totally got dropped.
Yeah, hey, you're back.
So do you want to hear my haiku?
Oh, yes, we'd love to hear your haiku. What's your haiku?
Woo! Green infrastructure, 3 cities, 3 different ways to deal with water.
Amazing.
Excellent.
Thank you both so much. Those were wonderful haikus. I just want to thank our guests, Lauren McPhillips and Marissa Matsler, for their time, their expertise, and their voices. And thank you for listening. And as always, if you have any questions about what you've heard or have suggestions for future episodes, you can reach out to us at Future Cities Pod on Twitter or futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.